All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to impartially unpack the massive, sweeping shifts happening in local, national, and international homelessness policies right now in 2026. If you've been following urban policy at all, you already know the landscape is changing at absolute lightning speed. So we're going to break down exactly what that means for your community. It really comes down to this one foundational question. Right now, Western democracies are simultaneously attempting radically different multi-billion-dollar experiments to solve the exact same crisis. We're literally watching entirely divergent approaches play out in real time. So let's break down the two main playbooks we're seeing right now. On one side, we have the traditional housing first strategy. This is the idea that you absolutely have to provide a stable home before a person can successfully tackle other challenges like addiction or mental health. But on the other side is the transitional and enforcement strategy, which prioritizes temporary shelters, mandatory addiction treatment, state outreach, and camping bans.
To make sense of all this, here's our roadmap. First, the 2026 funding shift. Second, the grants pass fallout. Third, a different approach abroad. Fourth, the human cost. And finally, local level solutions. Okay, let's jump straight into part one, the 2026 funding shift, a massive national pivot.
Here in the United States, federal funding is doing a massive U-turn, and it's completely scrambling how local agencies respond to the unhoused. Advocates are pointing out that the long-standing housing first model is basically being defunded under new federal directives. As Maria Foscarinas from the National Homelessness Law Center puts it, subsidized permanent housing is simply no longer a given. The government's priorities have fundamentally shifted, moving aggressively toward funding transitional programs over permanent housing. Which brings us to part two, the grants pass fallout and how enforcement is escalating. You see, this funding shift is working hand in hand with a totally new legal reality. You might remember the Supreme Court's landmark June 2024 ruling in Johnson v. Grants Pass. That was the decision that allowed cities to arrest, fine, and jail people just for sleeping outside. Well, the last 2 years have seen a massive legal acceleration from that. Moving through 2025 and into June 2026, in just 2 years, we've now seen over 350 cities and 14 entire states institute their own camping bans. And these legal changes on paper, they're creating severe, often shocking realities on the ground. In Grants Pass, Oregon, unhoused people are literally being forced into fenced-off camps. In Louisville, Kentucky, a pregnant woman in active labor was actually cited by police for sleeping outside. Down in Miami Beach, nearly half of all arrests recently made were just for outdoor sleeping. And tragically, in Atlanta, a camp eviction resulted in a fatal bulldozer accident. Compounding the whole thing, new federal directives are now actively tying critical funding to whether or not communities enforce these very bans. Though it is worth noting that advocates have successfully fought off similar camping bans in places like East Lansing, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
All right, let's move to part three, a different approach abroad, looking at the global mirror.
While the U.S. leans hard into enforcement, let's look across the Atlantic to establish a really clear contrast. To put things in perspective, the U.S. government is actively redirecting a staggering $3 billion away from permanent housing, paying instead for transitional setups, addiction treatment, and enforcement outreach. But then you look at the UK, where a newly elected leader is doing the exact opposite. New Prime Minister Andy Burnham just pledged £340 million over 3 years. His specific goal? Ending rough sleeping by building 1,200 new permanent homes. This funding, which was pulled from unused parts of their housing department's budget, aims to support 3,000 people over 5 years. It is a massive, direct investment in permanent housing.
Burnham is essentially trying to replicate the pandemic-era everyone-in policy, leaning heavily on the housing-first model he used when he was mayor of Greater Manchester. Now, his supporters absolutely love this comprehensive investment, but critics are quick to point out a pretty curious reality. Street homelessness actually rose during his final 4 years as mayor. So it's a powerful reminder that even heavily funded permanent housing policies face some intense implementation hurdles. Drilling down, we hit part 4, the human cost, and aging into the crisis.
Let's zoom way in and look at the data out of Hawaii. This is honestly heartbreaking. Nearly 1/5, 19% to be exact, of Oahu's unhoused population are kupuna. These are seniors aged 60 and older. These are our aging neighbors who have worked their entire lives, pushed onto the streets because their modest, fixed Social Security checks just cannot keep up with rising market rent. Often, it just takes one medical crisis or one rent spike to push a rent-burdened elder entirely out of their home. Connie Mitchell, the executive director of the Institute for Human Services, really hits the nail on the head here. She says housing is healthcare, and the economic logic is striking. Doing nothing actually costs the taxpayer so much more. Think about it. Paying for the ambulance calls, the emergency room visits, and the extensive hospitalizations that inevitably happen when fragile seniors end up on the street, that is far more expensive than simply funding prevention, like helping them with a rental deposit. But here's the kicker. Despite how effective keeping rent-burdened elders housed actually is, federal budget cuts mean the exact opposite is happening. The Institute for Human Services literally had to shrink their homelessness prevention program. They went from serving 347 households down to just 201 this year. So less prevention work is happening exactly when older, medically fragile demographics need it the absolute most. It's an incredibly frustrating reality for folks on the front lines. Finally, let's wrap up with Part 5, local-level solutions and grassroots action. While the big debates rage federally and national funding bounces around, individual cities are just getting to work. Out in Bellingham, Washington, they're taking immediate action by opening a 35 to 40 unit tiny house village by early 2027. It's managed by Homes Now, which uses this fascinating, self-governing transitional shelter model. The residents actually take an active role in managing the community themselves. This builds up a sense of shared responsibility and incredible peer support while they move toward permanent housing. And here's the playbook for how they build a functional community so fast. Step 1, the city pools money, an affordable housing levy, justice project sales taxes, and partner funds to hit a $1.2 million setup fund. Step 2, city planners build out the essential water and sewer infrastructure right on city-owned land. Step 3, Homes Now takes over the daily self-governing operations. By combining local land, tax funds, and a nonprofit management model, they are standing up critical infrastructure incredibly fast. Okay, let's pull all this together. If there's one major takeaway from today's explainer, it's that in 2026, there is absolutely no single consensus on the homelessness crisis. We're looking at a massive spectrum of deeply contrasting experiments. The U.S. is shifting $3 billion away from housing first and toward enforcement and transitional models. The Grants Pass ruling unleashed over 350 local camping bans. Meanwhile, the UK is betting £340 million to directly house people in permanent homes. And at the human level, states like Hawaii are struggling just to fund basic prevention for seniors, while cities like Bellingham take matters into their own hands by scaling tiny home villages. So, as all these drastically different policies collide in real time on our streets, we're left with a vital question. Federal enforcement, massive UK housing investments, or locally governed tiny homes. Which of these experiments is actually going to lead to a lasting solution for our most vulnerable neighbors? Well, only time, and the data we're gathering from these distinct paths will tell. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the policies shaping your own city.